1980. The first missiles had not yet landed, but the economy had already flinched, quietly, invisibly, before the sirens. There is a particular psychology to nations that believe their defense is impenetrable, a softness that grows beneath the armor. History does not remember the missiles that were intercepted, it remembers the ones that changed what money was worth the morning after. Every interceptor fired into the sky carries a price tag. Every price tag carries a question, and every question eventually finds its way to the market. So here is the paradox. What if the act of defending yourself is precisely what makes you vulnerable? There is a thread running through this story. You may not see it yet, but it was there from the beginning, woven into the numbers. Wars are decided by generals. Economies are decided by accountants, and the accountants always outlive the generals. What we're about to examine is not a battle. It is a ratio, a cost, a system under pressure that was never designed to hold this long. The pattern has appeared before, in different deserts, under different flags, with different weapons. The math, however, does not change. By the time this ends, you will not look at a missile defense system the same way again. Not because of the technology, because of the invoice. To understand where the fracture begins, you must first understand why the structure looked so solid. The Gulf region, across decades of the 20th century, built something remarkable, a system of deterrence held together by oil, alliances, and arithmetic. The United States committed its military architecture to the region, not out of sentiment, but out of strategic calculation rooted in energy dependence. Israel, a nation surrounded by adversaries since its founding, became one of the most technologically sophisticated defense economies on Earth. Iran, sitting on the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, transformed its revolutionary energy into military industry with extraordinary discipline.
This is the part that should concern you most. Not that someone made a mistake, but that no one did. Every actor was rational. Every decision was sound. The system failed anyway. American defense contractors built systems of incomparable precision. Lockheed, Raytheon, Boeing. They supplied the architecture of regional stability. Israel's Iron Dome, developed in the mid-2000s and operational by 2011, became the most celebrated short-range missile defense system in modern history. The Arrow system, designed for ballistic threats, and David's Sling, positioned between the two, completed a layered shield of genuine sophistication. Iran, responding to its own encirclement, accelerated a missile program that became the backbone of its regional deterrence strategy across the 1990s and 2000s. By the early 2020s, Iran possessed one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East, over 3,000 missiles of varying range and precision. Each actor believed the system was stable. Markets reflected that belief. Oil prices moved with the tension but never broke from it entirely. Defense stocks climbed. Insurance premiums in regional shipping were elevated but manageable. Institutional investors priced in risk, then looked away. This is what stability feels like from the inside. Not calm, not peaceful, but legible, predictable, priceable. And that is enough for capital to keep moving. The system held, and because it held, everyone quietly assumed it would continue to hold. That assumption was the first distortion. The distortion did not arrive with a headline. It arrived inside a procurement budget, buried in a line item that most analysts skimmed past. An Iron Dome Interceptor missile costs between $40,000 and $50,000 to produce. The rocket it destroys costs under $1,000. Read that again. Not for outrage, for economics. One side spends $50 to force the other to spend $50,000. That is not a weapon. That is a business model. Iran's military planners understood this asymmetry long before Western analysts wrote about it. The strategy did not require winning. It required exhausting. In the summer of 2006, during the conflict in Lebanon, Hezbollah, supplied and trained by Iran, fired approximately 4,000 rockets into northern Israel. Israel's military intercepted what it could, but the economic logic of the exchange rate was already visibly broken. Cost asymmetry had entered the calculation permanently. By 2019, drone and missile attacks on Saudi Aramco facilities temporarily cut global oil output by 5% in a single strike coordinated from Iranian-aligned forces. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, beginning in late 2023, forced global shipping companies to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days per voyage. Insurance premiums for Red Sea cargo passages increased by over 200% within weeks. Some vessels could not secure coverage at any price. The United States Navy deployed destroyers to intercept drones and missiles. Each Standard Missile 2, or SM-6, used in those intercepts cost between $2 and $4 million. Each drone being intercepted cost Iran's proxies between $10,000 and $20,000 to manufacture and deploy. The ratio was not sustainable. Not because the technology failed, because the treasury mathematics of attrition had already shifted the balance sheet invisibly. Meanwhile, Israeli defense spending as a percentage of GDP, already among the highest in the developed world, was climbing toward a structural threshold. The United States, carrying defense commitments across the Pacific, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East simultaneously, was absorbing costs that had no corresponding budget revision. Every rational people was making individually rational decisions. The distortion lived not in any single choice. It lived in the accumulated weight of all of them together. When expectations change, behavior follows, and when behavior follows, the system itself begins to move in a new direction. Defense procurement cycles, historically slow and bureaucratic, began compressing under operational pressure. The pipeline between order and delivery shortened, but the cost did not. Raytheon reported sustained production backlogs for interceptor missiles by the mid-2020s. Demand had outpaced industrial capacity for the first time since the Cold War. This matters economically in a way that goes beyond defense budgets. When military supply chains strain, they compete with civilian manufacturing for the same raw materials. Titanium, high-grade aluminum, solid-state electronics, rare earth elements. These inputs do not distinguish between a missile and a commercial aircraft. The market does not either. In 2022, the European defense surge triggered by events in Ukraine had already absorbed significant portions of NATO-aligned industrial capacity. The Middle East then added its own demand. The United States defense budget crossed $900 billion annually. Supplemental appropriations for regional operations were being passed without structural offsets. An offset, in fiscal terms, means cutting something else or raising revenue to pay for new spending. Without offsets, the spending becomes debt, and debt has its own arithmetic. The Federal Reserve, managing inflation from a decade of monetary expansion, could not simply print stability into a fiscal equation that was widening under military pressure. Treasury yields, the price the U.S. government pays to borrow money, moved. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Markets were beginning to price something they had not priced before. The question was no longer whether the defense architecture worked. It clearly worked, in a technical sense. The question was how long a democracy could sustain the invoice. Israel's shekel tracked the tension in regional markets with increasing sensitivity. Foreign investment flows into Israeli technology, a sector that had grown to anchor the economy, paused. Tel Aviv's stock exchange, home to some of the world's most sophisticated tech listings, experienced sustained outflows during each escalation cycle after 2023. Companies with Israeli headquarters began quietly establishing backup operational centers in Cyprus, Portugal, and the United Arab Emirates. Not publicly, structurally. Iran, carrying sanctions that had compressed its formal economy by an estimated 30 to 40% over the preceding decade, had built a parallel system of exchange. It had learned to survive outside the dollar system. Its trade with China, Russia, and regional partners operated through barter, yuan settlement, and informal clearing mechanisms. A sanctioned economy is not a destroyed economy, it is a restructured one, and restructured economies can sustain pressure in ways that surprise analysts who only read the formal numbers. The feedback loop was now visible to anyone who chose to look. Each escalation forced an interception. Each interception consumed inventory. Each inventory gap required emergency procurement.
Emergency procurement costs more than planned procurement, always, historically, without exception. The premium for urgency is a cost that no defense budget accounts for in advance. The cycle accelerated, and acceleration, in economics as in physics, means the distance covered per unit of time is growing. The system was moving faster than its architects had planned.
The irreversible moment in economic systems rarely announces itself. It is identified later by historians, looking backward at a sequence that seemed logical until it wasn't. In the spring of 2024, Iran launched a direct strike on Israeli territory for the first time in the modern history of the two nations. Over 300 drones and missiles in a single night. Israel, supported by the United States, Jordan, and other regional partners, intercepted the overwhelming majority. Publicly, it was presented as a success. Militarily, it was. Economically, that single night cost Israel and its allies an estimated $1 billion in interceptor expenditure. Iran's strike cost a fraction of that figure to assemble and execute. The success was real. The cost was also real. And for the first time, both things were discussed in the same sentence in financial publications, not just military ones. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan. Their regional desks began updating risk models in ways they had not updated them since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Oil futures markets, the most sensitive economic instrument in the Middle East equation, began pricing a new variable, the probability that the cost asymmetry would not self-correct. Shipping insurers meeting in London reassessed Red Sea exposure not as a temporary disruption, but as a structural rerouting with indefinite duration. Rates repriced accordingly. The break was not a bomb. It was not a collapse. It was something quieter and more durable, a repricing of assumptions that had held the system together for 2 decades. When assumptions reprice, behavior follows. When behavior follows in synchronized markets, the direction of capital changes. And when capital changes direction, everything downstream moves with it. Defense ministry officials in Jerusalem, Washington, and Tehran were all operating on the same battlefield. They were also, whether they acknowledged it or not, operating in the same economy. The interceptor math had crossed a threshold. Not a technical threshold, a fiscal one. The cost of defense had begun to reshape the economic landscape it was designed to protect. That is the break. Not the moment of explosion, the moment of permanent repricing, the moment when the balance sheet changes and does not change back. Aftermath is never what the headlines describe. Aftermath is the restructuring of ordinary economic life that happens after the cameras move on to the next story. In Israel, the technology sector, which had grown to represent over 18% of GDP and nearly 50% of all exports, entered a prolonged period of uncertainty. Venture capital investment into Israeli startups, which had reached a record $27 billion in 2021, fell significantly as the security calculus shifted for global funds. The human capital equation changed alongside the financial one. Skilled workers, particularly those with dual citizenship, began exploring relocation in higher numbers than any prior decade. This is not a judgment. This is a documented behavioral response to sustained threat, one that appears in every extended conflict economy throughout the 20th century, without exception. The shipping industry absorbed a transformation that will not easily reverse. The Red Sea route handles approximately 12% of global trade in normal operating conditions. A sustained diversion around Africa adds between $800 and $1,000 per container to shipping costs. In a globalized supply chain, that cost distributes everywhere it touches. Electronics, clothing, automotive components, consumer goods. The rerouting of Red Sea trade embedded a quiet inflationary pressure into supply chains across 3 continents. For the United States, the fiscal consequences accumulated in layers.
Emergency military aid packages required congressional authorization and carried long-term debt service obligations. The Congressional Budget Office, in assessments rarely highlighted by evening news programs, flagged compounding defense supplementals as a source of medium-term fiscal stress. Iran's economic situation contained its own specific paradoxes. Sanctions had created conditions of scarcity, but scarcity had also produced a population with high tolerance for economic pain. Iranian rial had collapsed in value multiple times since 2012. Each collapse trained a generation to operate outside formal banking, to hold gold, to transact in foreign currency informally. Economic resilience built through suffering is a different kind of resilience than economic resilience built through prosperity. It is harder to break precisely because it has already been broken. Regional governments, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, recalibrated their sovereign wealth fund allocations. Exposure to regional equities was quietly reduced. Diversification accelerated westward and eastward. The Abraham Accords, the normalization agreement signed between Israel and several Arab states in 2020, had been built on a foundation of shared economic interest and shared threat perception. Sustained escalation introduced new variables into that foundation. Economic partnerships are resilient, but they are not unconditional. They recalibrate when the cost of proximity rises too high. The oil market, which had long served as the region's economic shock absorber, was itself undergoing structural transformation. Global energy diversification was reducing the singular leverage of Gulf exports. A region that derived its geopolitical weight primarily from hydrocarbon exports was entering an era in which that weight was measurably diminishing, and the conflict was accelerating that timeline. Employment in defense-adjacent manufacturing in the United States expanded. Factories in Arizona, Alabama, and Arkansas added shifts to meet Interceptor demand. But the broader fiscal math remained unchanged. Jobs created by defense spending are real jobs. They are also expensive jobs, subsidized by sovereign debt that eventually requires servicing through either taxation, inflation, or both. The aftermath was not destruction, it was distortion. A slow, structural bending of economic systems away from their prior equilibrium toward a new one that no single actor had chosen or designed. There is something that every major conflict in economic history reveals, eventually, to those patient enough to read beneath the surface of the military record. Trust is the infrastructure of economic systems, not roads, not ports, not pipelines. Trust. The shared belief that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to justify investment. When trust erodes, not collapses, but erodes, investment slows. Capital waits, and capital that waits is not neutral. It is a decision, and decisions have compounding consequences. The Iran-USA-Israel equation is not ultimately about missiles. It is about the cost of maintaining a system of deterrence that was designed for a different era of industrial capacity. The Cold War's deterrence architecture was built on the assumption of two superpowers with roughly matched industrial bases, capable of sustaining enormous military expenditure indefinitely. That architecture was expensive, but it was symmetric. Both sides paid. Both sides exhausted themselves at roughly comparable rates. The equation balanced, imperfectly, but functionally.
The asymmetric warfare model, inexpensive offense against expensive defense, breaks that symmetry. It does not require the aggressor to win. It requires the defender to spend. This pattern appeared in Afghanistan, where improvised explosive devices costing a few $100s forced responses costing millions per incident over 2 decades of sustained engagement. It appeared in Yemen, where Houthi missile and drone campaigns forced Saudi Arabia to expend interceptors at rates that quietly drained defense budgets while the conflict dragged across years. It appeared in Ukraine, where drone saturation tactics forced defenders to make agonizing decisions about which incoming threats justified expensive interceptor use and which did not. The pattern is not new. The scale is. And scale changes the economic conclusion even when the strategic logic remains constant. What the Interceptor math reveals is not a military failure. It reveals a fiscal architecture built on an assumption that defense spending has no ceiling, that history has repeatedly, quietly, disproven. Every empire that ever extended its defense perimeter beyond its fiscal capacity to sustain it eventually reached the same moment. Not defeat, repricing. A quiet adjustment of what was possible. The Roman frontier, the British naval supremacy of the 19th century, the Soviet military-industrial complex, the American forward deployment model of the late 20th century. Each system, in its time, looked permanent to those living inside it. Each system had defenders who believed the costs were manageable. Each system eventually reached the boundary of what it could afford. That boundary is not a wall, it is a gradient. A slow change in what capital will finance, what populations will tolerate, and what institutions can sustain across successive budget cycles. Iran understood this gradient before its adversaries did, not because its strategists were wiser, because a nation that has operated under maximum economic pressure develops a different relationship with cost. When you have nothing left to lose in your formal economy, the cost asymmetry of warfare looks entirely different. Your opponent's spending is a vulnerability. Your own poverty becomes a strategy. This is not to say that sanctions failed, or that deterrence failed, or that any particular policy decision was wrong. It is to say that the system had internal contradictions that compounded over time, and compounding contradictions in economics, in finance, in military strategy, always eventually present their bill. The question is never whether the bill arrives, only when, and who holds it. The Interceptor math did not decide this conflict in a single night of missile fire. It decided it across decades of procurement cycles, budget negotiations, and escalation responses.
By the time the decisive exchange occurred, whatever form it ultimately took, the economic architecture surrounding it had already been reshaped by the accumulated weight of all prior decisions. That is how history actually works, not in dramatic moments, in accumulated decisions, each rational, each defensible, each contributing to an outcome that no single actor fully intended or foresaw. The weapons fired into the sky are visible. The fiscal trajectory that determines how many weapons any nation can fire and for how long is invisible, until the moment it isn't. And in that invisibility lies the real record, not of battles, of balance sheets, not of generals, of accountants, not of the missiles that flew, of the ones that could no longer be afforded. So the question that remains, quiet, patient, unresolved, is not whether the defense held. It is whether the economy behind the defense was designed to hold as long as the conflict required. And if the answer is no, not from weakness, not from failure, but simply from the cold arithmetic of cost ratios that no political will can permanently override, then what does that tell us? It tells us that the most important decisions in any conflict are not made in war rooms. They are made in treasury ministries, decades earlier, in the language of budgets and procurement cycles. The next time you see an interceptor streak across a night sky and hear the word success, pause for just a moment. Ask not whether it worked. Ask what it cost, and who will pay, and when. Because somewhere in a spreadsheet no camera will ever film, that answer already exists. It has always existed. It is the record beneath the record, the history beneath the history. And that, more than any missile, any alliance, any declaration, is what eventually decides everything.